The title of this khutbah is A Human Response to Climate Change, including parts. And I'm feeling both a little anxious and excited because I haven't given a khutbah before. And normally, while I work in the field of ecology, the kind of forums I'm involved with are more interactive. And so I'm open to feedback afterwards. And so if later, while taking snacks, you want to say, hey, Muzammal, when you got us to imagine ourselves as carbon dioxide clusters and grow bigger and bigger, I'm not sure that really works so well in the khutbah. So feel free to offer a bit of feedback afterwards if you like. So I'm going to... The part of the title, including all parts, could make this very long. But it's also an important part of what I feel is at the core of transforming the systems, social, economic structures that are responsible for many of the injustices that are taking place. I'm going to just describe a little bit about a background to climate change first, and this may be already familiar, but I'm going to just go through it just so we can enter into a context together and enter into space. And so essentially this is coming from a build-up of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And this build-up is largely from the use of fossil fuels and carbon dioxide emissions that come from that. And it's also from change in land use. So deforestation, land, forests are a sink for carbon, store for carbon. And if we engage in deforestation, or a change in agricultural practices can release carbon from the soil, that also is causing a buildup of greenhouse gases. And that increases the greenhouse effect, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, which allows the Earth to keep in heat. And as that increases, we get a further buildup of heat in the planet, and that's global warming that leads to climate change. And from an Islamic perspective, how I see this is that and how it's been articulated by a lot of people, is that there's a shift in the balance or the mizan, that the equilibrium of the climatic system has been disturbed. And this disturbance has consequences, it has repercussions. The increased heat, the increased temperatures means that we're more likely to experience heat waves. We're more likely to experience extreme weather events such as intense rainfall. And we're more likely to experience hurricanes. And that's because of the increase of heat energy leading and the higher temperatures in the atmosphere, allowing more water to be contained within the atmosphere. And we get more extreme rainfall, and also the increased heat energy allowing conditions for more frequency and intensity of hurricanes. So just to kind of give a picture here. Coupled also with the thermal expansion of water, these extreme weather events is going to lead to more flooding and more areas of the Earth becoming uninhabitable, leading to mass migration, and also because of the change in weather to food shortages. So the scale of what is developing is immense. And simultaneously, what is potentially possible is a tipping point when we move into a phase where the systems that are already there in nature begin, instead of holding onto carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, actually begin to release them and perpetuate the process. So, for instance, permafrost, as that melts, that can release methane, which is a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, accelerating the process. And all this could be captured in the Quranic term fasad, which can be translated as corruption or disasters or mischief. And in Surah Ar-Rum, in chapter 30 of the Quran, there's a fairly well-quoted verse that mischief or disasters have appeared in the land and in the sea because of what people's own hands have earned, that God may give them a taste of some of their deeds so that they may find their way back. So, and I'm looking at this from my own perspective here. How I see this is a way that the earth is vocalizing something, that the earth is communicating that it is out of balance, that something is dysfunctional. And this voice, to me, is also perhaps saying that there's a disconnect. Why have you forgotten me? Why have you forgotten the earth? Why have you forgotten nature? And why have we disconnected from the intelligence, the beauty, the wisdom that is there in nature? And instead, why have we moved to a system that is based on more artificial values, artificial targets, and artificial constructs, and moved away from nature? So, and there's also another verse in the Quran that captures the idea that the earth is holding on to its experiences that reflects the human condition, and that on the day of judgment, on the last day, that those stories will be revealed, that the earth will tell its stories. And the translation of that verse is, on that day she will declare her tidings because the Lord inspired her. And Yusuf Ali, his commentary on this is useful. So, inspired by instructions breathed into the earth personified, the earth is directed to tell the whole story of what it knows. And so how do we respond then to the earth when it's with these stories, with what it's communicating? How do we respond to this communication? The communication is getting louder and louder. How do we actually respond to that? And also, I want to draw in, maybe later, the reality that there's also quieter, softer communication from the earth, and the value of also being receptive to that. I think it'll also be useful to maybe share a little bit about some of the responses that are taking place in some of the social movements around the world in relation to climate change. So, on the one hand, you can have, there are groups that are working on changing policy. So they're trying to convince government, trying to convince corporations to change their policies. There's other groups that are involved with direct action and resisting change directly. So taking the power themselves and, for instance, trying to block activities taking place that pollute. For instance, trying to shut down coal-fired power stations. So there's a more direct action type of movement that exists as well. And there's also groups that are working to build alternatives to the existing paradigm. So, for instance, there are groups, there are communities that are set up in regions under the umbrella of what's called transition initiatives, where they build relationships with each other to create a system that isn't waiting for government to act, because they believe that if government acts, it will be too little too late. And they're taking things in their own hands to reduce their dependence on fossil fuels and reduce their overall energy use and build community. There's also permaculture, which is a way of mirroring the principles in nature to create human systems. And there's intentional communities or eco-communities that are being set up where people are trying to live in a way that is in harmony with nature, and are setting up their own ways of making decisions so they have their own governance in a way that's both relatively self-sufficient but also with conscious relationship with other entities. And one of the dimensions that I feel is important as citizens of this world is the idea of power, and what approaches have what relationship with power. Who do we give power to? Is it that if we ask for government to change policy, or we ask for corporations to change what they're doing, is it not possible that that is a kind of affirmation that this power that is held by corporations, for example, that should remain? Could that be possible? Or is there a way to actually take that power into our own hands? More so. Just to reflect on this idea of including all parts, I'm going to just go into my own journey with this work. And I started off in an environmental group, and that was our focusing on the environment. And we had that in our name. At some point, we took that out of our name because we realized that it's actually much more interconnected than that. That the reality of nature even is interconnectedness. That the environment isn't separate from human beings. That by naming it something out there, we're denying the reality that nature and us are all ultimately one, and that we are part of nature. Also the reality that the economic system is intertwined in nature, and how we construct our economy has an influence on how we relate to and how we use or support nature. And I just want to slightly summarize that as I understand it, because the system we live in is one in which we can lend money, banks can lend money, that they create, that money that didn't exist, and they can just credit that into our accounts as a loan. So this money didn't exist and we have borrowed it. And we have to pay it back with interest added on, interest that accumulates. Now, with all these loans going out and the interest that needs to be paid in addition to the loan, there's pressure on human activity to move faster. We're under more pressure to work harder, under more pressure to consume, under more pressure to buy, because we're also plugged into this system where advertising induces us to fit in to this system that wants to perpetuate itself. And it furthers the offering of more loans in order to keep things running. So the economic system is entirely tied into nature, because all this activity, all this economic activity is leading to an increase in resource use from nature and increased throughput through the system, leading to more greenhouse gases because of the energy that we're using from fossil fuels. So it's all actually interrelated. And I also realized on my journey that that if we want to create alternative systems, then it's really about us and relationship with each other in order to create systems that don't depend on the dominant economic system, corporate, power-centered system, that it requires an awareness of interpersonal relationships. After all, if we're trying to save the planet and we're oppressing each other, what good is that? Or if we're marginalizing, one another based on race or religion or gender or ability or disability in pursuit of justice, then what good is that? And so there's really something here about me, about embodying all the parts that we're working with, all the human voices, and the voice of the earth as well. So there's a deeper democracy here that I'm trying to communicate, of how do we actually include all the parts and give space for them all to have a voice. And that requires skill, and it requires conscious practice, in my experience. I recently attended a convergence on permaculture, and there was a woman whose name I've forgotten, and she has about 30 years of experience of working with intentional communities, with eco-communities. And she said, she's also involved with training people, and she asked the question, why is it that so many eco-communities fall apart? Why do they fall apart? And it's not because of the fact that they don't necessarily know how to compost, or that they can't put up solar panels. That's not the reason. The reason is usually it's the interpersonal stuff that is why they fall down.
Sorry, could you repeat that? It's usually because
of the interpersonal stuff, why they fall down. And in her own community, they made a commitment of not running away from conflict, not running away when things get difficult, because that's the place where there's an opportunity for something new. And there are approaches to working with groups that actually, for instance, one approach, it names this point at which there's conflict. It names it, for instance, as a hotspot. And by naming it, it gives it space. And by giving it space, we can enter into that space and work consciously with it in order to listen more deeply and to come out with something new that allows for the system to come back into balance. So I'd like to just invite us to a little exercise. One of the themes that is running through this talk is this theme of voices that we marginalize, the earth in particular, and the repercussions of that. And marginalization is something we will all have experienced personally. Maybe in brief moments, maybe it's a consistent experience for us, for whatever reason. And I'd like to invite you just to be aware of what it felt like or feels like to have been marginalized yourself. And just notice what that feels like, what comes up for you emotionally, having been marginalized. And I'd like you to enter into a heart space. And so putting the attention onto the heart and putting a cradle of compassion around that feeling of being then to include that compassion around others in this room. And then to include the wider world, regardless of gender or religion, age, race, ability or disability or privilege, and to include everyone. And then to include the earth itself and all the species and parts of the earth. And just noticing what voices we can be aware of with this exercise. And where that takes us. And I'd like to say a little bit more about nature. In the Quran, the term used to describe verses in the Quran is the same term used to describe nature. And that's the term ayah, which means signs. Signs that point to God. So nature and the Quran both reflect qualities of God. They are reflectors of that quality. And a friend of mine, he said, so why is it that when we're reading the Quran, we can't say we're actually contemplating nature? Or if we're in nature and contemplating nature, why can't we say we're reading the Quran? And so the Quran gives a lot of value to nature that I feel we're neglecting. And indeed the approach of permaculture, which I feel blends really well with Islam, is about considering nature to be a teacher. And by distilling the principles in nature, we can actually create systems that are resilient and beautiful. If we also reflect on the reality that in nature there's actually no waste, that something that is a so-called waste from one part of nature is actually a resource for another. So we can see the intelligence that's working there when we've got greenhouse gases building up unused and creating the imbalance and the impacts of climate change. Also from looking at the relationship between the economy and nature, what happens when we put money in a bank? Normally, it would accrue interest and it will grow and grow and grow, regardless of the outer conditions. Okay, what would happen if we took a piece of nature and stored it? It would decay. So if we take a piece of nature, it tends to decay, and that tends to get absorbed back into the system, assimilated into the system, and used up. So the idea of zakat, which is about taking money that is stored and putting it back into the system, is one that is a greater reflector of the way that nature actually works. And it's more plugged in to a system that is connected to the reality of what's going on around it. It is in relationship to others. So we are in relationship to others with a system that is connected to what's going on around and meets the needs of others. So I'd like to just finish on where next. And normally with khutbahs, it's very tempting just to say, do step 1, 2, 3, these 3 things or these 4 things. And I know when I'm listening, I'm often, not always inspired to take those steps that I'm given, I confess. And personally, I find it more meaningful if I discover those steps myself that are personal to me. So I'm going to just put out a question there, that with others and together, how would it be possible for you to play a part in creating alternatives that meet more and more of our needs, alternatives to the existing system? So if we're already in our groups or in networks or in some community, how can we begin to meet our needs and be less dependent on the dominant system? How would we govern ourselves in a way that's democratic, that reflects the principles, embodies the principles we want to see out there? Where would our food come from? What sort of relationship would we have with the land on which it's grown and the people who produce it? How would we resolve conflict? Because these are skills in building alternative communities. And maybe this question, even this question may not seem relevant to some of us, but I'm just putting it out there as a belief that some of the changes that we need to make are quite radical. So I don't want to stay away from that belief that I have. And if there's a couple of suggestions I would make, one is about being in nature and spending time contemplating within a natural system, within woods or something that is less affected by human activity. And when I say nature, I also mean ourselves, our inner processes, our inner landscape, and being present to what's going on in terms of our feelings and in our emotions. There's a verse in the Quran, chapter 51, it's through Al-Dariyah. On the earth are signs for those of assured faith, as also in your own selves. And so there's something in that about nature out there and nature internally being essentially reflectors, being both sides of the same thing, pointing to the same thing. And the final suggestion that I want to put out is consider having a conversation, just one conversation, about what some of this might mean to you with somebody afterwards or at a later date. So if that resonates, then maybe just make a commitment for that. Subhana Rabbika Rabbil Izzati Amma Yasifun wa Salamun Alal Mursaleen Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Glory to thy Lord, the Lord of honour and power. He is free from what they ascribe to him. And peace on the messengers. And praise to Allah, the Lord and cherisher of the worlds. May God forgive me for any errors I made, and God knows best. Salah is held.